Hello and welcome to Developod, the podcast from IATEFL's TDSIG, Teacher Development Special Interest Group. We are thankful for our sponsors, Bridge, Cambridge, and Nile. And like always, I'm Helen. And on today's episode, I'm very excited to be introducing Dr. JPB Gerald. Justin, welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Glad to be here. Sorry for all the rescheduling, but they won't really know that listening to it, except for
Yeah.
the fact that I just said it.
That's all right. Um, Life happens, and our listeners know that, although it might be edited out, we'll see. So, Justin, could you start us off by telling us a bit about how you would describe your ELT self?
Um, I think that it's interesting because I don't do a lot of classroom language teaching these days. I say by a lot, I don't do any. I did it for 9 years in a pretty standard fashion. A lot of people, they go overseas, and I did
Mm-hmm.
that.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized one of the things, it depends on the questions you ask me later, so I don't want us to say everything right now,
Mm-hmm.
just because you might ask about it.
Mm-hmm.
But like I realized pretty early, maybe the second year, that
Mm-hmm.
I had some sort of ability to connect with the students.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't understand what that reason was until much later, but I was like, I'm good at this part, but I don't know what I'm doing, like
Mm-hmm.
pedagogy wise.
Yeah.
So I came back to New York and I went to school.
Mm-hmm.
And then I didn't really want to do public school. I don't have like a problem with it. My son goes to public school, but like I wanted to work with adults, so I
Mm-hmm.
did. And I did that for several years. But like there's no money in that field.
Mm-hmm.
And I met my wife and she was like, I don't know about this. Uh, but like that's still my background ultimately.
Mm-hmm.
Like no matter what I do from day to day, my
Mm-hmm.
ultimate foundation professionally is in language education. So
Mm-hmm.
these days, I mostly write books, essays, etc. My many interests with language, I suppose English, but that's just the language I speak.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and my research into like race and neurodivergence and stuff like that, they all
Mm-hmm.
sort of filter into it, but ultimately it all started with language. So these days I spend a lot of my time haranguing the ELT industry over what I believe to be its many faults.
Mm-hmm.
That's basically who I am now.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a heckler.
So I should call you Dr. Heckler Gerald then.
Yeah, it's funny. Yeah, I mean, it's just because like the first book I wrote,
Hmm.
was about the industry itself and its various structures. And I just sort of said at the end of that book, like, there's not a whole lot I can do if the industry doesn't listen to me. And of
Hmm.
course it didn't. So now I'm just like, well, I told you so.
Hmm.
Uh,
Is that antisocial language
yeah,
teaching?
yeah, that one.
Yep. If it's all right, I'd like to talk a bit about the book itself. I mean, how did you said you wanted to heckle ELT, you wanted to see some change, so this book came about. Could you tell us a bit about the process of that? How did you stay motivated and keep that heckler spirit going?
What's interesting to think about these books is I just wrote my third book. It'll be out next year, which we can talk about later. But
Hmm.
um, although they've all happened in fairly quick succession to the
Hmm.
point where like it will have been like a book every 2 years by then. I need to
Hmm.
figure out what's going to be book number four.
Yeah.
Um, I was still at very different periods of my life when I wrote each book.
Yeah.
Obviously, I was older each time, but not that much older. But the main point I'm bringing up with antisocial language teaching is that like the whole story, which is in the book,
Hmm.
is that, but not everybody has read the book, but is that like I was a doctoral student, and in my very first semester, I told the professor like I wanted to write books at some
Hmm.
point.
Yeah.
And, you know, I didn't know it would happen, didn't know how it would happen.
Hmm.
And I went on with my life. I wrote an article that got published,
Hmm.
and I was happy with that. And I'm like, great, because not everybody gets published, and
Hmm.
not everybody gets to publish more than once. And then in the spring of 2020,
Hmm.
right? My second article was released on, race and language teaching was called, I think it was called Worth the Risk. I can't remember what these, I made up the title, but Decentering Whiteness in English Language Teaching, right?
Hmm.
And because the article came out in the spring of 2020, when everyone's stuck at home
Hmm.
and everyone's paying attention to stuff for a second, I got a chance to do a lot of like talking
Mhm.
because the industry was briefly, very briefly interested in reflecting on itself,
Mhm.
very briefly. But in that very moment, and again, I did not write that article because of this. I wrote it in January 2020 before any of this stuff happened. But
Mhm.
it came out then, and people wanted to talk to me, including IATEFL. I gave a
Mhm.
talk for IATEFL in July, I believe, of 2020.
Mhm.
And then the person who had asked me to give the talk said, you should write a summary of the talk. And the publisher read the summary. They didn't even see the talk, which is the funny part. They read the summary of the talk that I wrote
Okay.
about what I said, and
Mhm.
then they contacted me and asked me, they said they like to work with me. And I'm like, oh, okay. And then I was like, well, now I need an idea.
Mhm.
And I had a
Pressure's
whole,
on.
I never have a shortage of ideas, but they're not all necessarily coherent. Like, I have
Mhm.
ADHD, the things are all over the place. I didn't know, I hadn't been diagnosed yet at that time. But the point is, I was like, okay, what? So I was thinking of something I was going to do for school
Mhm.
that wasn't so much about language. It was just
Yeah.
sort of about race itself, race and education. And I said, well, I'm already going to do this semester. So what if I can find a way to weave language into it?
Mhm.
And that's where the idea came from. And
Yeah.
then this sort of like framing device of antisocial personality disorder, which I'm not really sure why I came up with that anymore, but I think it was just that like I needed a way to bring in sort of mental illness and so forth, and the way that people of color, people of other backgrounds are, well, we all know with, especially with like gender and gender dysphoria and things like that, that people who aren't along the quote unquote mainstream have been tagged as being unwell for however
Mhm.
long.
Mhm.
And so I thought it was an interesting angle. There's a couple of times in that book where I look back and I'm like, that's kind of a sweaty comparison. I don't know if that one really, that analogy quite works. But how does the process is that like I was in a bad place when I wrote that book. That's not why I wrote the book.
Mhm.
But like, I mean, we're all in a bad place, COVID and all that. But what I mean is specifically is that like I had very recently, I got the book contract in September of 2020.
Mhm.
And then I didn't start writing until February 2021, just because
Mhm.
that's just when I told myself, like I prepared and so forth. And each of the books I've given myself, like, Justin, don't start writing right now.
Mhm.
Give yourself a few months
Yep.
because I've just sort of forced the energy to build up and then it all comes out and I write it really fast, right? And each of these books takes me a few months of actual writing once I get going. But the point I'm making is that like I was in a bad place professionally.
Mhm.
I had been doing very poorly at my job.
Mhm.
And you know, they kept saying like, why are you being careless, whatever, which is a very common ADHD thing for people to think you're careless when you
Mhm.
right aren't focusing. And I'm like, it's 2020. Obviously, I need a job. I need my at that time infant to have health insurance.
Mhm.
Um, and so, but I was still making mistakes. The mistakes I was making weren't that important, but
Mhm.
they were mistakes. Like I did
Mhm.
make the mistakes.
Yeah.
And then once I saved my job, I don't even know how much they wanted to fire me. I think they were trying to scare me in retrospect, but whatever. I said, why was this happening? Why
Mhm.
couldn't I focus? And that I later got the ADHD evaluation. But the point is, when
Mhm.
I wrote the book, the actual text of that book,
Yeah.
I had just come out of like I might lose my job during a pandemic.
Mhm.
What is going to happen to me? I was terrified. So I
Mhm.
wrote that book as if my hair was on fire, which is funny because I don't have hair. Uh, and then the next book was more of a sort of solemn thing after my diagnosis by ADHD in people of color. And
Mhm.
that book's a lot sadder and stranger, but I was also in a better place with the diagnosis, with my
Mhm.
career. I didn't feel scared. And then this last book
Mhm.
is more, again, things that continue to get a little bit better for me, progression. And I've been much more sort of reflective. And also, the first book has jokes in it, but the
Mhm.
book's funnier and funnier. And
Ah.
it sort of reminds me of an old Chris Rock joke about, he's like, if you see an unhoused person with a funny sign, things probably aren't that bad. Things are really bad. They don't have time to have a funny sign.
Mm.
It's so that's not exactly what he says. This is the 90s, but still, you get what I'm saying. It's like
Yeah.
it's
Yeah,
a little
yeah.
bit I'm a little bit more relaxed the
Yeah.
further I go into the books, and there is absolutely no relaxation in that book. I'll tell you that.
So the process mostly stayed the same. What was different was your circumstance at the time, how you were feeling, what you were
Right.
thinking, what was going on in your life.
Yeah, the aims, obviously
Hmm.
every book has a different topic, but
Yeah.
like what changed between each book was me.
Hmm. Yeah.
um, which is interesting because part of why, these are mostly academic books, right?
Hmm.
A high-selling academic book is like hundreds of copies, not millions.
Yeah.
So I'm mostly sure it's a little bit of money, but I'm also just really interested in having this sort of, timeline of me at I think my writing is me at my
Hmm.
most cogent and coherent and interesting.
Hmm.
And it's interesting to have this sort of like, they're like yearbooks,
Yeah.
you know?
They're charting your journey through
Right.
life, through ELT, through so many things.
Exactly.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, it's funny because this year TDSIG turns 40 years old. 40 years of teacher development, we say. It was one of the first ITEFL special interest groups. Um, and so our theme is looking back, looking forward. So thinking about looking, I mean, we were just looking back when you were talking about the process of your book and you're working on another, you're looking forward to book four. Um, do you think that writing, publishing is always going to be a part of your journey?
I think that like I'm one of those people where like my parents keep threatening to retire and they don't, and it's not a
Mm.
like sad economic thing. I think they just need stuff to do,
Huh.
right? I mean, that is 80 years old, and he's just like he's never gonna stop.
Mm.
Right? And he's not doing like physically demanding work. It's not like that. But like it's just he needs to. I'm sure, yeah, he wants the money, but like it's just he needs, my mom is like, I'm gonna retire, I'm gonna retire. It's like, yeah, she needs the money, but also like in the sense that like it's nice to have the money. But
Mm.
like I'm like, mom, you need stuff to do. Because like even if she were to retire, it would be like retired, but I'm going to sit on the board of this company and I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. Like they
Activities.
need stuff to do, right?
Hmm.
And I am that way. My wife is different from me, and that's not negative, it's just different. But like I know that even if I stop having a normal work office situation in the
Hmm.
future, I'm going to keep writing.
Hmm.
I need to.
Hmm.
And one of the things that's been so fun for me this decade since 2020, I mean the decade of the 2020s, I know it's only been 5 years, um, is that to back it up a little bit, in 2017, the
Hmm.
job I had previous to the one that I ended up doing poorly and saved my job and all that, I
Hmm.
got that job in early 2017. And then someone left a position there 6 months later and suggested to me, Justin, you should apply for this. It was like a pay bump. And I was like, okay. So it was an internal promotion. So I applied for it. And because that job was technically a writing job, it was technical writing, but it was writing. They're like, we need to see a writing sample. And I was like, I haven't written anything in 5 years.
Hmm.
I loved writing.
Hmm.
Not so much as I loved making up superheroes when I was 5, but I'm not talking about that. Not that that's not writing, but I'm not talking about that.
Hmm.
But I was like, I wanted to be a fiction writer or a screenwriter when I was
Yeah.
younger.
Hmm.
That was my dream, right? I love ideas. I wanted my ideas to matter,
Hmm.
right? Um, and then I
Have an
had a bad ex
impact.
yeah, and I had a bad experience where I did write a couple of novels when I was in Korea. They're
Hmm.
not good. And I sent one to who was at the time my best friend. He didn't really say anything, which is fine. And then we had a falling out, and then he told me how much he didn't like the novel and was really, really cruel about it to the point where I
Hmm.
stopped writing fiction.
Oh.
He wasn't wrong about certain things. They weren't necessarily bad, but they were
Mm.
true in the sense of like he said all the characters sound like you. And I'm like, yeah, I guess that makes sense. Which is part of why when I went back to writing, it was nonfiction. Because
Yeah.
I'm like, I guess that's the voice I have. It
Your
just
own
happens,
voice.
right?
Funnily
Um,
enough.
so to go for to be in 2017 where I had to go find in my email an
Mm,
assignment from my master's program 5 years earlier as the
mm,
last thing I could find that I wrote that was like a legitimate thing because I always had like blogs, but like they weren't really formally structured.
mm,
Um, and to get to where I'm best able to because the thing about writing is that I do try to write. I don't want to say informally, but accessibly.
mm.
So it
Yeah.
sounds like me talking, but it's not obviously speech, right? It's
Hmm.
still structured sentences
Yeah.
and paragraphs and arguments and so
Hmm.
forth, right? But, it basically forces me. I like podcasts and so on and speaking, but it forces me to take my points and really underline them, right? I have my
Hmm.
opinions regardless, but my best arguments are in written form because I don't remember everything
Hmm.
when I'm talking, and I
Yeah.
don't claim to. And well, people who think that they do, I thought that, so anyway, yeah, I think that's really me at my best because it retains my voice,
Hmm.
but it's backed up by, actual evidence and so
Hmm.
forth. And it just forces me to really push it, you know?
Hmm. Yeah. So the challenge of those processes has been something that has kept you going.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I really, there's a couple of things happening when I'm writing.
Hmm.
Yes, I'm trying to make a point,
Yeah.
but I'm also writing with certain people in mind because
Yeah.
I also like, so much academic writing is so impenetrable.
Hmm.
And like the main reason I didn't apply to a doctoral program for several years
Hmm.
is because, I'd read journal articles before and I'm like, what is this? What is this? What are these words? I don't understand this. And
Yeah.
I thought for years, I don't know if I'm smart enough for this, right? And then I get into the program when we're reading all these articles and I'm seeing how people are taught to create these articles and what the structures are. And I'm like, oh no, this is just bad writing.
Mm. Yeah.
And I was like, oh,
I've
so
read
I
some of those.
yeah, so I think to myself, like, okay, so the real issue
Mm.
that like I consider it a mission of mine to create more and more writing that
Mm.
is not like that.
Yeah.
Because, academia is understandably worried about like, generative, LLM, right? And I'm like,
Hmm.
you know, a lot of those journal articles feel like they're already written by those. Because
Yeah.
you just give it like if you give them your data, I'm not saying that we should do this, but I'm just saying if I gave somebody like data, like I mean quantitative data
Hmm.
from a study I'd done and said,
Mm.
write me a journal article about this, it could probably do it.
Yeah.
Because you're not asking it to do the
Mm.
actual generation of information. You're just like, give me a structure. Because they're so formal and they're so,
Mm.
like, and to the point where you realize they're not even about writing. They are
Yeah.
writing in the sense that they are words, but
Yeah.
it's really just a delivery of data.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's why when we would read these articles, like you just flip through to the findings and the discussion.
Yeah.
Or when you go to the lit review and be like, maybe there's some things I can read.
Hmm.
Um, and
Actually read.
yeah, actually read because like, which is why like I thought that I didn't like theory before I started again, and I realized that like I do think you do need some sort of grounding for the
Hmm.
theory to have some weight. But
Hmm.
on the other hand, like at least in some of those articles, depending on the writer, they're not all good, they sound like people.
Hmm.
And then you realize that there are scholars who sound like people.
Yeah.
And I always would, and one of the things that I did that was not apparently common was like, unless you're reading an article from the 60s or something, most of these people are alive.
Yeah.
And they work at universities, a lot of them. So
Mm.
you can find them.
Hmm. Yeah.
So I would read the article. I'd be like, that's a good article. And I would just email them like,
Yeah.
hey, I liked your article. And
Yeah.
they didn't always respond, but none of
Hmm.
them were rude. Either
Yeah.
they never responded because they were busy, or they told me they were busy,
Yeah.
or they said, sure, let's talk.
Yeah.
And like, almost all of the people in the like race and language space, like Dr. Flores and Dr. Rosa, like I have spoken
Hmm.
to all of these people at some point. They're
Hmm.
not like my friends,
Mm.
but like I have I can say that like almost all the people in the corner of the field that I'm in,
Hmm.
maybe not in the last couple of years because I haven't been as in it, but like I have spoken to all of them at some
Hmm.
point. And
Yeah.
like they are people, whereas there are fields where that would be uncouth. But well,
Yeah.
I don't care.
We're not in those fields.
Yeah.
Speaking of the human element, I mean, you've spoken about a friend who, well, a former friend who impacted your, you know, drive to write. I mean, what about people who've impacted you in other ways in terms of writing, in terms of ELT in your career? Ideally, hopefully, they'd be more positive. I I hope.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's been a couple of things, right?
Mhm.
I obviously had professors in my master's program who were
Mhm.
supportive of me, but again, I wasn't really doing publishing type stuff back then. That's when I was really just sort of learning about teaching, and I owe them a lot. But,
Mhm.
as far as my writing, it really was both earlier and later. Like a couple of like straight up English teachers I had when I was younger
Mhm.
who still, yeah, especially one teacher who I thank in all my books, and I have no idea if she's ever read any of them. I know she received my last book, but did she
Mhm.
read it? Who knows?
Mhm.
Um, and I remember her talking about like, do not repeat a word in a
Mhm.
sentence unless it's for emphasis,
Yeah.
right? Come up with a synonym,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
And my last job I hated because they were like, no, 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 use the same word over and over again. And it was so boring, right?
Oof.
And like now I'm just like, it's still in my head. And it's
Mm.
like she always said, like, if you can sneak some alliteration in there,
Mm.
right, it'll make it more pleasing to the reader, even if it's not like a poem. And I do that
Mm.
all the time.
I love
Sometimes when
alliteration.
I go back through something and I just sort of like, I could change that word, you
Mm.
know? So I
Mhm.
think about that because that's not ELT, but it's language.
Mhm.
And then the people who've really affected me more recently, as I've been doing these books,
Mm.
it's like positive and negative, which is to say, like, I have I got over so the difference
Mhm.
between my friend sort of stopping my fiction short
Mhm.
and what's happening now is now I have enough confidence in my skill that
Mhm.
when people come after me for nonsense, it inspires me to go further,
Mhm.
right? Because like even this third book that I'm currently like seeking like blurbs for, it's being
Mhm.
edited, etc., right? The whole point of this book, which is called The Public Pedagogy of the Master Narrative, which is an annoyingly academic title, but the subtitle is The Stories We Tell Ourselves About Race and Language Around the World, right?
Mhm.
The whole point of this book is that my first book, the one you held up, right? I wrote that book, and although I tried to be fairly global with it, the fact of the matter, because it's about the industry,
Mhm.
people were coming out of the woodwork saying, like, well, he's writing from an American perspective. I'm like, what other perspective do you expect me to write from?
Well,
Uh,
the perspective you have.
right. And I
Yeah.
said, and then, I would get people, especially like in the UK, or you get people in Canada and
Mm.
so on, not the ones I was close to, but the ones who didn't really seem to be engaging with the actual arguments,
Mm.
saying things like, well, okay, maybe where he is, but, not over here. Right. And I'm like, okay, why is it they think that? It's one thing to be dismissive because
Mm.
whatever. But like, especially like older scholars, I would hear this from.
Mm.
And I would say, you know what? Well, let's see. And so
Mm.
it's actually like a bunch of interviews with people from different part scholars and other educators, et cetera, from around the world with the sort of like the general assumption worldwide is that for people who aren't really paying attention, which is most people, is that
Mm.
like when we think of racism, we think of like, like slavery and Nazis, basically,
Mm.
right? And yeah, but there's a whole lot of other stuff,
Mhm.
right? And I think that sort of overarching narrative, the master narrative, that
Yeah.
is also pushed out through media, not always on purpose. Like sometimes it's just what the makers know, so they think that
Yeah.
that's true. That's what the public pedagogy is, right? Is
Hmm.
pop culture. Also, I was so happy to write a book where I could talk about movies a lot.
Yeah.
And makes it so that so much else in different parts of the world is sort
Hmm.
of pushed underground.
Yeah.
And again, not always intentionally. I'm not letting people off the hook, but I'm just saying it's like it's a byproduct, not
Hmm.
just like a dastardly plan. Sure, there is a plan, but like most
Mm.
people are just sort of going along with what they're told. I would
Yeah.
say that my chapter on the UK is like I told you this book is less, hair on fire, angry.
Hmm.
The UK chapter, I am definitely that's the one where I'm like going the hardest in this book because it's just sort of like I've heard especially because the publisher's British, right?
Hmm.
And a lot of the IATEFL, a lot of the talks I've given to, British Council, things like
Hmm.
that,
Yeah.
and like so much of so many of the people who have tried to fight with me about my work have
Yeah.
been British, right? And
Yeah.
I do this little math problem because the UK likes to look down on the United States for a lot of reasons. And one of the reasons in terms of race is that they talk about, oh, well, we stopped slavery before you did. And I'm like, so I looked at it and I said, yes, technically outlawed the slave trade in 1807,
Hmm.
technically. But they didn't outlaw slavery in their colonies, which was most of what they owned, right? So
Hmm.
not ideal. And then in 1833, they said, fine, we won't do that anymore. But that they had to pay off all the slave owners, including many members of parliament, right?
Hmm.
But let's give them all the credit in the world, which is
Yeah.
to say 1807. Not that's like we shouldn't, but let's just, for the sake of argument, do 1807. And when did they enter the slave trade? Was like 1562 or something like that, right?
Hmm.
And so if you look at the United States, technically the country didn't exist until 1776, but we could say 1619,
Mm.
right? Even though those people were British, but we don't need
Mm.
to talk about that,
Yeah.
right? Like you're starting from 1619, you're talking about British people, but like,
Yeah.
anyway, so let's say 1619, even though again, those were British people, but fine.
Yeah.
Um, and then 1865, right, for
Hmm.
Juneteenth. And then if you do the math, this is giving the United States as little credit as possible and
Yeah.
giving the UK as much credit as possible.
Hmm.
It's still only 1 year less for the UK.
Yeah.
It's like 215 to 216.
I
And it's
mean,
like,
should we celebrate a year?
right. And it's also, but it's not because like the 1807 is ignoring the
Yeah.
other 26 years and
Yeah.
so forth. And it's
Hmm.
also 1619. Those were British people. Like technically it's really 1776 to 1865, right? Versus 1562 to 1833. So like it really is more. But, I
But
just
those
think
are
that
just
there's a,
numbers. That's
right,
not like human experience. That's just
right,
quantitative, not qualitative. How do you even measure that? Which I
right.
suppose is
Right,
the.
that's the point. Is that like one of the people I interviewed is a woman who was a scholar from the United States who at the time was living in I see the time was at the time was living in the UK, and she said like living here has made me more patriotic than I've ever been, and that really makes me upset.
Oh, wow.
Just because like she's like obviously there's so much racism in the United States, but what she was
Yeah.
basically saying is that like when she would try to have these conversations with her colleagues in the UK, like they were basically stuck in the 90s in
Hmm.
terms of their progress. And part of it is obviously population and so forth,
Hmm.
right? And I make a sarcastic joke about how the UK should be very proud of it only being like 83% white because it used to be like 95, right? And it's like it like the UK is basically equivalent to the whitest American states,
Hmm.
which is like Maine and Vermont and stuff like that.
Hmm.
So which is funny because that's New England.
Yeah.
Um, so, and I make that joke because I have a chapter on New England. I have make that joke there too.
Hmm.
So anyway, I know we're coming up on the time. So if you have any final things you'd like to ask.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked a lot about, your journey, publishing impacts, the future of your ELT journey you think is going to continue as in a publishing focus rather than in work or anywhere else. Um, if you could pick one thing that you want our listeners to take away from our conversation today, what would you like them to take?
I mean, I think that there's, you know, I try to put takeaways in all of my books and chapters and
Mm,
stuff like that, just because I do think that, like, although I don't want to just give people a checklist, which I think is superficial, I also don't want to be like, here's the thing I wrote. Okay, bye. Like, I do think it's important for people to be like, now what do I do? You
yeah,
know, I can't tell everybody what to do because everybody's circumstances are different.
yeah.
But I can say
Hmm.
that, like, the lesson, and this is in my dissertation and it's everywhere, is like one thing I learned from the research I've done, from many of the interviews I've done,
Hmm.
is that, like, everyone can work against these things.
Hmm.
Like, it 30-second version of a story before it goes off. When I went to Ecuador when I was in my 20s, and they showed us
Hmm.
caimans, like
Yeah.
crocodiles, right?
Hmm.
And I know they're not crocodiles, but they're similar. They're in the
Hmm.
crocodile family. And piranha, right?
Okay.
And then that evening we drove to the middle of a lagoon, and they're like, all right, and then everybody jumps in the water, right? And I'm
Oh.
like, no, I knew there's piranha. I'm like, I didn't even bring a bathing suit.
Yep.
Right? And but
Hmm.
like now I don't want to be the only person who didn't get in the water. So I'm in my underwear and I jump in the
Yeah.
water. A couple of things happened. First of all, the water was warm, which I didn't expect.
Mm.
'Cause- Which is also, and then I hit the ground almost immediately. It was only 6 feet deep. Now I'm short, but still, if I hit the water pretty immediately, I was like, oh. And I see the time. And I said, oh, it wasn't as bad as I thought.
Yeah.
I tell everybody the metaphor about the boat and the water in terms of like dealing with race and
Hmm.
oppression and everything is that, like, we're always trying to bring one person in the boat. It's never going to be a big enough boat. You got to
Mm.
get out of the boat and get in the water with everybody else,
Hmm.
because if you get out there and really live your life trying to challenge these things,
Hmm.
it's not as bad as you think it is. You're
Yeah.
not actually going to get eaten by a piranha. And then they told me also that they were messing with us because the piranha stay by the shore. That's why it was safe. We did see them, but they were not in the middle of the lagoon. So,
So we just have to try jump in feet first and go for
right,
it.
right.
Thank you so much, Justin. I really appreciate you coming on the show. So, everyone, if you want to know more about Justin, you can find him on his website, jpbgerald.com. Any other places? Your
I mean,
podcast?
every various place, it's all
Mhm.
on there.
Yeah.
So, follow me on various things. Most of them
Mhm.
are either JPB Gerald or Dr. JPB or some version thereof.
Thank
So,
you. All right. Well, everyone, don't forget to stay in touch with TDSIG. Follow us on our social media platforms after you follow Justin first, of course. You can find us as TDSIG or IATEFL TDSIG. Subscribe to the show. And thanks again to our sponsors, Nile, Cambridge, and Bridge. Thank you for listening. Thank you for joining me again, Justin, and see you all next time.